So today, this is the part 2 of our training webinars with Dr. Deirdre Mendez from University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Deirdre, thank you again for joining us today. Before we get started, maybe you can, maybe we can get a quick review of what's the difference between part 1 and part 2, just in case we have anyone join us today that wasn't able to take part in last week's, just kind of what we did then and what we're going to do today.
Sure, that's my first slide.
Okay,
or my
great.
second slide. So I'm definitely headed in that direction.
Excellent. Well, I won't jump the gun then.
No problem.
So right before we get started, one last announcement. Yes, everyone, this will be recorded and we'll be posting the slides to the GPS website either later on today or tomorrow for future access. If you weren't able to join us for part 1, that is already up on the GPS website. So if you want to take a look at that, by all means, feel free to do so. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, go ahead and type them into our question section. If it's pertinent to the section we're on, we'll ask Dr. Deirdre about that question. And as usual, we will have the last 10 minutes or so open for Q&A. So just want to let you know that's the structure of today's webinar. And now we'll turn the wheel over to Dr. Deirdre to get started.
Hello, and I'm delighted that you joined in either again or for the first time. We're going to be talking about cultural analysis again. If you didn't have a chance to do this, it's a good idea. You don't have to have the toolkit downloaded necessarily to participate, but it will make your participation more, a little bit more useful. You're welcome to participate without it in the presentation today and then go back and decide whether you want to download the toolkit later. And also, there was another aspect of preparation for today, which was to answer the questions in the behaviors and attitudes section and fill out the self-assessment chart on page 34. So when you do that, you end up with a self-analysis, a cultural profile of your own tendencies, and that can be useful to you. We're not actually going to discuss that today. That's something we did in part 1. We talked about the personal profile, and then we reviewed 2 cultural dimensions. So today we'll be moving on beyond that. If you want to go back and do your profile and go through part 1, that's fine. But if you're just picking up today for the first time, you should be able to follow along without any difficulty. We're going to start with 2 new cultural dimensions, and I'll remind you that there are 8 in the toolkit. We're going to do 2 today. We've done 2 already, so you will know half of the 8 dimensions. And we're going to do a scenario practice so that you can practice picking up on what's going on in a transaction, in a relationship, so that you can begin to develop some strategies for preparing and adapting to people who have different cultural tendencies from your own. All right, so here is our next cultural dimension, direct and indirect. And this has to do with attitudes towards explicitness in communication, especially communicating any kind of conflict. Direct people are people who have as a goal in communication to get the point out. They want to get to the point. They want to tell you what they mean. They want to be clear. They want you to be sure to understand. They consider this the shortest path between 2 points, to say what you really mean. And when it comes to conflict, they don't worry too much about conflict. They figure that clearly stating your position, even if someone else is in disagreement, is the best way to get the conflict resolved. And so they're pretty direct. They have a tendency to debate. They don't mind criticizing other people's ideas. An important thing to know about really direct people is that they separate people's ideas from the person themselves. So if I'm direct, I feel that I can criticize you. I can tell you what's wrong with a plan that you're suggesting or an idea without injuring your feelings. We'll still be friends, and you'll either debate me and support your own ideas with a counter argument, or you'll come back with a revised plan and we'll move on from there. direct people predominate in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and Australia, and they tend to be fairly common in the U.S., although there's a geographic difference in the U.S. So people from the Northeast are famous for being very direct, in the Midwest, and people in the Southeast tend to be more indirect. And indirectness is characterized by communication that is not confrontational, that very carefully avoids confrontation, and that goes in a sort of circuitous manner where people try and figure out what's going on with the other person before they come out and say what they really think. And so they can be very careful not to cause offense, not to disagree with other people. The way that they perceive this is that it's being polite. And it can be completely baffling to really direct people because they expect when they ask a question, what do you think of my idea? Indirect people have a tendency to say, oh, well, that's a good idea, and not want to say, actually, it's a lousy idea. And they will give subtle cues and hints like their tone of voice or the expression on their face or the way that they say something. My mother was always very indirect, and she could say scathing things about a person, and nobody who didn't know her would ever know that she was saying something negative. And this causes problems for direct speakers because they don't read between the lines enough to hear indirectness. And indirect speakers are very common in Latin America, most of Asia, and the Middle East. And the way that this manifests itself can be that someone will actually say yes when they mean no. For example, you're showing them a property and they kind of nod and smile, and maybe you get the idea that everything's not completely okay, but then on the other hand they're kind of telling you, yeah, this is fine, and so you're really not sure how to proceed. So this is the difficulty of dealing with indirect speakers. Highly direct speakers may be a little bit confrontational and annoying and possibly sort of aggressive, but you always know where you stand with them. Indirect speakers are very difficult to understand for a person who's more direct. All right, so here are some characteristics of direct people. They say what they mean, they're clear on their needs, they're clear on what they dislike. You'll know where they're coming from. They can be blunt, and they may be offensive by your standards if you're a little bit more indirect. As clients, it's really easy to do a needs assessment with direct people. If they know what they want, they'll tell you. That doesn't mean they always know what they want, but as soon as they have an opinion, you'll know what it is. It's easy to narrow down options. You can say, do you like this, do you like that, and they'll be able to say yes or no. And as their agent, you will know where you stand. If they're unhappy with you, they'll let you know. As professionals, if you're dealing with another agent or a broker, it's unlikely that they're going to have a lot of hidden agendas. They're not secretive people. They're pretty blunt, and they tell you what's going on. Indirect people, of course, are kind of the opposite. To start off, they'll be very polite. They'll be positive and friendly, and they will not criticize. It's difficult to know whether you're getting real feedback from them because they do have a tendency to be so polite. The way to get the real scoop, indirect people, is to talk in a more relaxed setting. So if you're meeting in your office and you're not sure things are going well, you might say, let's meet in a coffee shop and just visit a little bit. It's really important to sound them out before moving forward, because very often with indirect people you can find that you've gone sort of past a point where you're no longer in agreement, but you don't know where you diverged from that agreement that you had at one point. So you kind of have to back up, and doing that in a relaxed setting is helpful. They can be unclear in their communication. There may be a lot of subtext and hidden meanings where they won't tell you why something is sort of negative. A direct person will say, I don't like it, and here's why. An indirect person will say, oh, that's very nice, but, and they'll give you some sort of little indication that you can't really decipher, because it's they don't give you the full story. So you have to draw them out. You have to work a lot harder with indirect speakers, and this is definitely true of Asians. It's also true of Latin Americans. I had a friend from Mexico, and she told me that when she was young, her mother told her it's not polite to refuse an invitation. So if someone invites you to do something you don't want to do, say yes, but don't say when. So they give you part of the story, but not the other part, and you have to find out, you have to figure out that you're getting vague communication and that means that something's wrong. So as a client, indirect people will not state their needs clearly. They won't tell you exactly what they want. They won't give you a list of criteria, or if they do, they'll be extremely vague. And they're very hesitant to list negatives. So they'll tell you kind of what they want, only not in very specific terms, and they won't tell you anything that they don't want. And they don't like to discuss money. They're very indirect about that, and they often, because it's so difficult to talk directly to someone you might have a difficulty with, they prefer to use mutual acquaintances for difficult relationships. So a lot of indirect people will come to you based on referral, and if that's the case, you're in luck, because you can go to that person who referred you and say, you know, things are a little difficult with your friend so-and-so, and I'm just not sure that I'm really meeting their needs because I don't feel like I'm getting the full story, and I think they're a little bit worried about the second house that we looked at, but I'm just not sure why. I was wondering if you could help me out with that. And because they understand how that game is played, that person will probably be willing to do it. And the deal with a mutual acquaintance is that they don't have any face in the game. So by embarrassing you and telling you you've shown them a house that they don't like, they would be causing you to lose face. But by telling the mutual acquaintance, they don't have to insult you directly, and then that person can tell you. So again, it's a very complex game that is sort of played with communication with indirect clients, but it's something that you really need to understand if you're going to be successful with those people. As professionals, they don't like to deliver any kind of bad news, so you won't hear about it until the last minute. They'll put it off because it's so embarrassing and painful for them to have to give it to you at all, and they will wait until there's no possibility of things turning around, and then they'll tell you. And so very often you'll be blindsided, and your reaction will be, well, if you'd only told me this a week earlier, maybe we could have done this, that, or the other thing, and it's not possible. They won't mention subtext, so they may just tell you, well, this didn't work out, and if you're trying to salvage a deal with another agent, with an indirect agent or whatever, you may never get to the bottom of it, but if you are trying to salvage the deal, you've really got to say, well, let's go out and get a cup of coffee and talk this over and see if there isn't anything you can work out in a relaxed, very non-confrontational way. You have to be on your best behavior. You can never get angry or become confrontational with an indirect person, or you'll just lose them as a client or as a colleague. And indirect professionals sometimes have hidden agendas. They may be whatever it is that they're trying to do, even if it's something you might help them with, they probably won't tell you about it because it doesn't come naturally to them to share information. So this can be a difficult feature to work with. The other dimension I want to talk about today is the expressive neutral dimension, and this has to do with how much emotion people provide when they are communicating with you. So expressive people are easy to read. They're the ones who get excited or angry easily, and if things are going well, you know it, and if things are not going well, you also know it. Expressive people give a lot of feedback. They, you can tell by their gestures and their facial expressions what they're thinking about. Latin America, the Middle East, the Southern European countries all are expressive. So if you think of Brazilians or Italians, it's easy to understand this feature. This is not a hard one to understand, but it's one that causes problems in communication, and we'll talk about those. Neutral people don't convey much information with their body language or their facial expression. These are people who control their features, and some of them are taught, in Asian countries, people are taught from birth not to give away what they're thinking or feeling, because in some countries they're taught by their parents when they're very young that giving away your feelings gives strength to your enemies, because they know what's going on with you, and that you have to learn to control that. And so people who have a neutral demeanor, people from Northern Europe and Scandinavia, for example, and many parts of Asia, will be difficult to read, and you won't get much feedback from them, either physically and possibly verbally as well. They tend to speak less, they speak more slowly, and they provide less information. Expressive people, when you're dealing with them, they're easy to read. You will know whether they like what they're seeing or what you're telling them easily enough. You won't have to fight for that. They may be a little bit exaggerated, so this is probably a feature you've come across before, but you'll see people who, they love a house and they think the rest of their lives, their happiness depends on it. But then when you show them another house, well, actually, that one's okay too. So their initial reaction can be kind of exaggerated. They need interaction. They need to feed off of your expressiveness as well. So if you're not a very expressive person, you need to be more enthusiastic when you talk to these people, or they can become depressed or feel that things are not going very well. As clients, you will know their reactions. You'll be able to read their facial expressions and their body language. And you'll hear things like, oh, I'll die if we don't get it, and you need to not take that too seriously, because it's possible that this is just a little bit of an exaggeration. Or on the negative side, they'll say things like, this deal is over, or this is a deal breaker, or I'm walking away from this. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's always the case. It's just that expressive people express themselves that way when they're unhappy, and so you may need to help calm them down, and you may be able to bring them back to the table. As professionals, again, their reactions may seem extreme. My client would never accept that, and you haven't suggested anything really unreasonable. For expressive people, really logical arguments don't work very well, because they're in the emotional situation, and you have to respond with an emotional, you have to come up with an emotional response. So when my husband says, do you want to do this or that, I learned early on he's very expressive and I'm pretty neutral. And so I'm very logical, I'm very task-oriented, and if he would say, would you like to do this, I would say, no, I don't think so. Let's do something else. And what he would, or if I had a complaint about it, like, well, it's going to be too late for me, what he really wanted me to say was, oh, I'd love to do it. Yes, it sounds like a great idea. Wouldn't that be fun? Unfortunately, it's too late for me. So he wanted me to lead with emotion, and that's what I have learned to do. So don't lead with your logical argument. Don't say, this is ridiculous. No contract in North America would ever be worded like that. Say, oh, thank you so much for getting this to me on time, and and then talk about, we have a bit of a problem, and then launch into your logical argument. And again, expressive professionals can become angry when things aren't going well, so be sure to kind of help calm them down and don't take that too seriously. All right, neutral. People tend to be very quiet in their voice and their emotions. They don't express much emotion. As clients, what may be difficult for you is that they don't seem very engaged. You show them a house and they don't say much, and you can't tell whether they like it or not. You may really need to spend some time prompting them about their preferences and their reactions. If they don't say much, you can say, well, did you like the other one better, or can you tell me some things you liked about it or things you didn't like about it? You may have to work a little bit harder to get the feedback that you're used to. And then as professionals, the same thing when you're trying to figure out how something's being received by the other side in a negotiation, for example. It may be difficult to read them. It doesn't mean, though, that they are disengaged or they don't like your offer. It just means that they are not providing that. They're not used to providing a lot of feedback until the end. So we've looked at 2 new cultural dimensions, and now let's take a look at a scenario where you are in a situation where you're advising a young realtor named Ashley, and Ashley's having a problem. But knowing what you now know about cultural dimensions, you can give her some hints on what she should do. And we'll walk through this scenario analysis, and then we'll practice using the toolkit. So take a minute to read the scenario first. All right, so you probably recognized that Ashley is direct. She's asking direct questions. She's trying to get to know Mr. Tanaka. He, on the other hand, is indirect. He's not giving her much information. He's not saying things either positively, things that are positive or things that are negative. He didn't have any specific criteria. He's not going straight to the point. You probably also noticed that Ashley's expressive. She was enthusiastic and gave him an enthusiastic handshake, and she's trying to get to know him, and she's asked him questions about his family. On the other hand, Mr. Tanaka is very neutral. He hasn't told her much. He's not giving her much input. His limp handshake, by the way, is a characteristic of Asian speakers, of Asian people. They have a tendency to dislike aggressive, firm handshakes. So we're taught in the U.S. that we should that a limp, weak handshake is a negative, but it's important to realize that in some parts of the world, the kind of handshakes that Americans give are considered aggressive and kind of brutal, and that's perfectly normal for that part of the world. So Ashley and Mr. Tanaka are very different people. They differ for both of these 2 cultural dimensions that we've talked about. So let's look at how Ashley might understand Mr. Tanaka. And we're not going to go through a detailed analysis here because we're not face-to-face, and not all of you have your toolkits. But I want to point out that if you went to the reactions and interpretations of the section of the toolkit, you could look up direct dealing with indirect. And if you did that, you would see that indirect people tend to view direct people as lacking in tact and finesse, as being pushy. He may perceive that Ashley is forcing him to voice negatives. If she says, "Do you not like this?" and she's forcing him to say no, that he's going to cause her to lose face, and it's embarrassing to have to say no so directly. So she might say, "Well, you may not like all of the features. I thought that the gym might be a little small," and by voicing it herself in a negative way, that gives him an opportunity to either agree with her or to say, "Oh no, the gym's okay, but," and come up with something else. So he may perceive that she's overly exuberant. She's rushing up and shaking his hand and asking him personal questions, and this may feel too direct. Also, people who are neutral, like Mr. Tanaka, tend to think that people who are extremely expressive are a little unstable. Oh, they're always so excited about something or so angry about something, and they, is this person really a serious, responsible business professional? So these are things that you can find out about the direct, indirect dimension and the expressive neutral dimension in the reactions and interpretations section of the toolkit. In the coping with differences section, that section offers ways to deal with the opposite feature that you have. So actually, if she had filled out her personal profile the way that you may have on page 34, she should know that she's quite expressive and that she's quite direct. And she should be able to tell from Mr. Tanaka's behavior that he is neutral and indirect. And she could go then to the Coping with Differences section, and she could prepare to deal with him looking at some of the recommendations there. Allocating extra time would be a really good beginning. It's very important to do long needs assessment with indirect speakers. You really have to find out what they want. It's not a good idea to start showing houses until you really do have a good sense of what they want. And then find a mutual acquaintance, if possible, somebody they know that they can talk to if things go badly. And then she needs to adapt to his style to some degree so that she doesn't set off warning signs. So one thing that she can do is tone down her expressiveness just a little bit so that she seems serious and a little quieter than normal. She wants to avoid yes-no questions that place him in a position of having to criticize something that she's just shown him. And then look for subtle clues in his behavior. I was dealing with a Chinese man, and I noticed that every time he had to say something negative, he would put his hand over his mouth. And that was his, if I had been a poker player, I would call that his tell. But that was the way he dealt with having to say something he didn't want to say. And so I would know when he put his hand over his mouth that whatever he was thinking was much more negative than what he was actually saying. So if he said, oh, well, that might be okay, but I would know what he was really saying was, no, that's terrible. That's not going to work at all. And usually there are sort of subtle behavioral indications when things aren't going well. Looking at the ground, Japanese people have certain kind of way that they kind of suck in their breath that's very well known. And so there are those kinds of things to look for. And then again, use social occasions to get honest feedback. Go out for a drink. Actually, alcohol is very widely used in indirect societies because people use it as an excuse to speak the truth. So if you are someone who is comfortable with that, you can use that as an opportunity. But it doesn't have to be alcohol. You can go out for a cup of coffee or a meal. And sometimes that's the way to salvage the deal, is to talk about anything but business until you're on a happy footing, and then begin talking business at the very end. Finally, Ashley could go to the Learning from Them section of the toolkit and look at ways to approach any difficulties that she's having with her indirect neutral client. First, she might notice that she should begin with positives. Anytime you have to say something difficult, anything that's going to be unpleasant to hear with an indirect colleague or client, you should begin with positives. Then you go very gently to the negatives. And if she's making a suggestion and she gets any resistance at all, she should back off and try and go around that and come up with something else, or let them suggest what would work better for them. Find out why she's getting that resistance, but never push. Never say, well, what do you mean you don't like that price? Or what do you mean? You would want to say, oh, well, is the price too high, or is it a question of timing, or something along those lines. And then again, use a mutual contact if the discussion stalls to avoid losing that connection, because if you push too hard with an indirect person, you can definitely lose it. So these are some recommendations for dealing now with 4 of the cultural dimensions that are in the cultural analysis system. What it comes when you're dealing with difference, it's very important to become a cultural chameleon. And what I mean by that is to identify the cultural features that other people are displaying, to focus on strategies and not your reaction. So your initial reaction may be, gosh, I can't believe this person is so difficult to deal with. And you need to go ahead and have your reaction and experience that fully, but then you need to become strategic. And you need to say, okay, what am I seeing in this person? And what does this tell me about their cultural orientation? And what strategies can I use to be successful and overcome their objections or whatever the issue is? And then finally, you want to tailor your demeanor and communication as much as possible. If you're dealing with people who are very reserved and quiet, you should take that as a cue to be as reserved and quiet as you can, because that will make them more comfortable. So you want to adapt your behavior to match theirs as much as you're able to do. And I know at KW, if you've got someone with a disc profile that's uncomfortable for you, you may find you have a variety of ways of engaging other people who may be better at that with that particular type than you are. You can do the same thing with the cultural features once you understand them. So again, I want to point out that the information is available at the website on this slide, and there is also a video. And the video involves two scenarios, a scenario with two companies. And the companies have different cultural features. And you can use the toolkit to go through a series of exercises where you identify all the cultural features that they have, and then you predict difficulties that they would have, and then you suggest solutions. And you see how they come together and do and don't communicate successfully. So by the time you've gone through the whole video and the analysis, which takes about an hour, you should be very comfortable with the cultural features and how they show up. So it's a good tutorial in case you're thinking, gosh, 8 features, that's too many. At the same time, you don't need to be concerned about all of the cultural dimensions. When you do your personal profile, the ones that you need to focus on in your work are going to be the ones where you are pretty extreme. If you're in the middle of a dimension, if you put your personal X in the middle of any dimension, that means you can go both ways. You'll be able to deal with clients and colleagues from either end, and it won't give you too much trouble. So you don't really need to think about those anymore. The ones you need to worry about are the ones where you are extreme. And in the places you're extreme, that means you're going to have less flexibility and more extreme reactions to dealing with people with those opposite features. So that's where you would need to focus your attention in the toolkit on dealing with those people.
We have a question that's kind of related to that from
Sure.
Steve. You know, I don't think it's breaking news that the world is becoming smaller due to globalization. We're becoming more interconnected. He's asking, do you see a trend in the indirect cultural world adapting more towards the direct cultural world, or on any of these spectrums? Do you see, due to globalization, do you think those spectrums are becoming smaller in a way that there's less of a difference between indirect and direct, or do you see those boundaries getting smaller because of globalization?
Mm-hmm.
What's your opinion on that?
Like they should, right. It seems like they should be, doesn't it? It seems like we're mixing more with people who have different tendencies. In some places I see that happening, but in a lot of places you actually see people choosing to be with other people who are like them. So when you see an ethnic community in a certain geography, that's a group of people who are choosing to have neighbors who are from their same country and who reaffirm their own values and who are comfortable for them to deal with. And so there are always people who act as a cultural bridge. So you may know some of those if you're operating in a community where there are people who are very successful there. Many times those people are a bridge to the broader community, but many of the people who are more insulated will be very strongly oriented towards their native culture, and so you don't necessarily see that mixing. In certain places where there's a lot of contact and people are really forced to interact with each other, they do learn those. They do learn the other side's perspective. But in many places, in many cases, what they do is stereotype, and they say, well, I don't like people from that place because they're so rude, or they're so aggressive, or they won't tell you what they think, they're dishonest, or whatever. And we see a lot of that these days too. Instead of everybody becoming one happy family, we see a lot of polarization.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's a great answer. Mercedes is taking it to another level and bringing in the issue of gender. So she's asking, in your opinion, when you have a couple that is, one is direct and the other is indirect, but the man might be the one who is in control, how would you go about handling yourself in that situation? Would you respect the man who is kind of, leading the business and he's direct, or should you try and accommodate both their cultural backgrounds?
I think you have to be very careful. You have to try and see whoever's in control is probably the person that you need to talk to. And in very hierarchical societies, Asian, Middle Eastern societies where one person is dominant, spending too much time on the other person can be negatively perceived. And so you do want to play it by their rules if you want to be successful with them. That doesn't mean you have to like it in every case, but it means that you will be more effective. So if you are dealing with a couple where the man is extremely dominant and the woman is almost silent, you can assume that he's speaking either that her opinions are not going to be taken much into consideration, or that she's going to be giving him her opinions in private, and that he's the official spokesperson for both, and so you would want to deal mostly with him.
I see. Interesting. Now, I think you kind of alluded to this earlier. And this is my own personal question. I think for people, in general, realtors tend to be very direct and expressive people. But wouldn't you agree that it's worth the time and the effort to really engage with indirect and neutral customers, because they offer, I think you were mentioning, once you kind of get past those initial, frictions and you can meet their needs, they're going to open you up into their network and give you those referrals. And I don't know, the way you made it sounded like it was a much more sustainable way of doing business. I wonder if you could either give your opinion on that or give a little bit more information on,
Sure.
that aspect.
Sure. Suppose you have a large Japanese community in, suppose you're living on the West Coast somewhere, and you have a large Japanese population and they have quite a lot of money, and you'd like to have some clients from that community. They're very indirect, they're very neutral, they're very hierarchical. There are a lot of things that Americans aren't, and so you might not be familiar with that way of doing things, and your first interaction with them may be similar to what Ashley's going through in our scenario, and your reaction might be, I can't deal with these people. They don't communicate with me. They're too hard to deal with. On the other hand, if you can crack the code, that is to say, if you can hang in there long enough to interact successfully with them, you may become one of those cultural bridges, and then they may begin to refer to you. And you need to realize that every time you deal successfully with someone who has a different cultural orientation from your own, you'll learn a new strategy and it'll become easier. And one of your colleagues will say, oh, those Japanese people, they're so difficult to deal with, you can't understand what they're thinking. And you can say, well, if you take them out to lunch, you can eventually establish a relationship, and the better you know them, the more they'll tell you, and and you can suddenly discover that you've become the expert. So it's definitely, if this is a client base that you're interested in, it's definitely worth investing the time and energy to get to understand them a little bit, know where they're coming from, and meet their needs, both emotionally and in terms of the homes they're looking for. All of you know, I certainly don't have to tell you that real estate is about meeting people's emotional needs, and it's just a question of figuring out what they are sometimes.
Are you familiar with the book, what is it, Kiss, Bow, Shake Hands, or Shake Hands?
Mm-hmm.
What's your, would you say that's a handy tool in addition to this content on getting a little bit more, specific on country to country, on, maybe someone in the audience works exclusively with, I don't know, Swedish buyers. Maybe that's something that they could use as a tool to learn even more about that country and their cultural orientation.
Sure, there are thousands of sources out there that will help you figure out where a particular country is coming from. The only problem with the country books is that not everybody in that country is just the same. So suppose I said to you, "Oh, Americans are neutral." We're not very expressive. Yeah, because compared to an Italian, Americans are very neutral. But are all Americans that you know really neutral? Well, no. And Americans are very direct. But I just gave you an example about my mother. She's not very direct. She's from the American Southeast, and she was raised not to ever raise her voice and that kind of thing. So the problem with the country profiles is that they characterize everybody in a country as being the same. The point of cultural analysis, the reason that I'm giving you this more complex model, is that if you deal with a Swedish person who happens to be extremely expressive and you're expecting them to be very neutral, you can look at this person and instead of saying, well, you're Swedish, I have to do this or that with you, you can say, oh, you're an expressive person. I know how to deal with expressive people. Whether they're from Sweden or Italy, you can figure out how to deal with them. So it's definitely useful as a starting point to have a country profile. But you will discover that, for example, if you're dealing with a Japanese community, older people and younger people are very different. People from large cities and the rural communities are very different, just as they are in the U.S. So you want to, it's useful to have a country profile as a starting point, but you don't want to rely on it too heavily. It's much better to be able to look at a person and say, I can tell by your communication, no matter where you come from in the world, I can tell that you have this, 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 and this feature, and I know how to respond to those features, adapt my behavior accordingly, and I know what to expect from you as a client, as opposed to, oh, you're from Argentina, you must be X. Because that's just too great a generalization in this day of the mobility that people have and diversity within any country.
That's so fascinating. There's quite a large response of people agreeing with you on that. So, yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's why it's so important to be conscious of these kinds of tools and in your business, just knowing that you need to be prepared for anyone and everyone. So this is the kind of resources that you need to rely on to be successful in that area. So, gosh, yeah, that was the cherry on top to me. Let's see. Guys, we're just about done. If anyone has any additional questions, go ahead and send them in. If not, then we can end this a little bit early if need be. Let's see. None coming in yet. I'm trying to think if I have any additional questions myself.
Well, if anything comes up, I usually put my email address on my first slide. Yeah, it's there. And
Okay.
you're welcome to be in touch with me with questions. I encourage you to go to the website that I mentioned. You can look at the video and go step by step through it. That answers a lot of questions for people, and it helps it all make sense. And feel free to be in touch with me if I can help you with anything.
Great. Yeah, that's. Someone's asking if we're going to have a part 3. No, I don't think. I think we pretty much exhausted Dr. Deirdre's time and energy in this, but not in vain at all. I thought this was a fascinating set of training for our GPS members.
Well, if there's another opportunity to work with you, I would be delighted to.
Absolutely. We'll explore that avenue later on. Again, everyone, this webinar is recorded and we'll be putting it up to the GPS website, if not later this afternoon, tomorrow for sure, in addition to the PowerPoint. So the directions to the video that Dr. Deirdre was referring to, you'll be able to access that once we put it on the GPS website, as well as the link to the toolkit if you were not able to do that beforehand. I think we'll wrap it up there. Dr. Deirdre, thank you again so much for your time and for your knowledge. I think we all left here knowing something that we didn't know before, which is always invaluable. And
my pleasure.
We really, really couldn't thank you enough. So, guys, thank you very much for coming on today. And we are going to end it here. Thank you very much.
Have a good afternoon. Thanks.